Boy, so the New York Times has decided to label Philip DeFranco as alt-right. As if the term alt-right hadn't lost all of its meaning entirely, I guess the New York Times set out this morning to completely bury the term once and for all. They ran a article in the Sunday edition of the New York Times today. It was a puff piece of a man by the name of Caleb Cain, who I've never heard of, but apparently he says that he was a former YouTube radical. He says that back in the day he got red-pilled, and now he's back to being a sensible, good male feminist. The thumbnail for the article, which is getting a lot of attention, has a collage of screen caps from a bunch of YouTube videos that apparently radicalized this young man, one of which, or at least a couple, I think, feature Philip DeFranco. Philip DeFranco, of course, is the most moderate, middle-of-the-road, inoffensive man on YouTube. He doesn't have any controversial opinions that I can think of. He's not exactly an anti-feminist. He does talk about politics, but sort of from a, I guess, neutral sort of perspective. I mean, I believe he's of the left, primarily, but he's not exactly a leftist or a right-winger by any means. So, as you might imagine, he took offense to being used in the thumbnail for an article about alt-right radicalization, since he does just, present the news and try to explain it to people. But apparently, presenting the news, if you're someone other than NBC or ABC or the New York Times or CNN or CBS, well, then that means that you're radicalizing people to the alt-right. Not to mention, of course, that it was the mainstream media people who made the term alt-right mainstream. I'd never even really heard the phrase alt-right until CNN and the New York Times decided to start picking it up, and they decided that this was going to be the next great moral panic. It was the alt-righters coming to take over America. They were going to conquer the world with white supremacy, and they were going to kick the Negroes back to Africa. Now, of course, the folks that the New York Times has been trying to get us so worried about, the white supremacists, are still a very small group of people, smaller really than they've ever been. I mean, back in the 60s at least, you had people who actually were members of the Ku Klux Klan. You had folks who were willing to go out and, protest and, burn crosses and things and shout about how much they didn't like the blacks. But now, however, in order to keep up the moral panic, what the New York Times and other folks have had to do is basically broaden the scope of what their alt-right term means, because it's so apparent now that how they originally defined it, white supremacy, is really not a problem at all in America, despite all of the racial provocation which has gone on in recent years. So the idea then, if they're able to broaden now retroactively the term alt-right, they can lump in people who fall under this new definition that they've created with the white supremacists, and therefore, ergo, they're all white supremacists. And so now it looks like the new term alt-right that they've decided, or where I'm also seeing far-right more. These terms are being used interchangeably, it would seem, far-right and alt-right. That really means anyone, whether they're on the left or the right, because this also includes plenty of people on the left, who is not really in the corporate media. Because there's no reason why you would include someone like Philip DeFranco with anyone on the right, because he's not exactly a far-left guy, but he's certainly not on the right. He's not a conservative. He's not, Ben Shapiro. He's not Rush Limbaugh. The only thing he has in common with somebody like Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder is that, he's not a member of one of the corporate media conglomerates. Philip DeFranco, I believe, is still the #1 person on Patreon. He's the biggest independent creator in the world, other than, somebody like PewDiePie or some of those other entertainment-based people. But I guess as far as the news crowd goes, I'm pretty sure Philly D's #1 by far. And this absolutely pisses off the corporate press more than anyone I think could ever imagine. Because you see, there are these people who go to J school, journalism school, at places like Mizzou, the University of Missouri, or Columbia, or some of these other, prestigious journalism schools. They go and they get into these student loans. They go to school for 4 years, and then what happens when they come out? They get a crappy job working, trying to write newspaper articles, and that's even if they can find a job, for something like, under 30 grand a year starting salary. And then you've got somebody like Philip DeFranco or Tim Pool, who just decided, you know what, I don't want to work for one of those companies. I think that that's a really crappy work experience. I don't want to be in an office like that. I'm going to go out and do my own thing and post YouTube videos. And they make more than really the most successful journalists by a pretty wide margin. Now, other than jealousy, the New York Times, of course, has other motivations for running this kind of hit piece on pretty much the whole of YouTube, and that's to promote their moral panic, which their readers, the kind of people who subscribe to the New York Times, really would just eat right up. Your older, very wealthy people on the center left who are, mainstream leftists, not, far left types, absolutely love the idea of a secret alt-right cult on the internet who is radicalizing young college students of all people. Because, of course, when you think of college kids being radicalized, it's always to the left because, they go to universities and things. But here, no. The real people radicalizing college students are the right-wingers like Philip DeFranco on YouTube. The real problem aren't the Marxist professors saying that we should abolish America and, send the white people back to Europe or whatever nonsense they believe. The real problem is people who offer alternative news outlets to CNN. The problem in America is just not enough people are watching CNN. Look at their ratings. Their ratings are plummeting. Why? It's because people want the alt-right news. They go to people like Alex Jones and Philip DeFranco, who are exactly the same. They go to people like Steven Crowder, who is exactly the same as Philip DeFranco and Alex Jones. There's no diversity of thought amongst these people. They're all alt-right, which means they're all neo-Nazis, and they hate feminism. And of course, by being someone who is against feminism, that means not only that they want to keep women in chains, but in fact they'd like to kill women. I believe the New York Times had an article on that man recently. There was a man who went and murdered a bunch of women because he was a virgin and he was mad that he wasn't a Chad and couldn't get all the Stacys. All of this reminds me so much of the moral panic of the 90s with video games, when people decided to blame the Columbine shooting on violent video games. Folks like Tipper Gore, wife of Vice President Al Gore, they decided to take all the decadence and decay that they saw in society, and they said, why are things not as good as I remember them being when I was a young person? And they look at young people and they say, well, what do these young people have that we didn't, that makes them so much worse than us? And of course the answer was video games. The real problem was Nintendo. It was id Software. It was Microsoft. All these things that didn't exist in the 60s, the baby boomers, and really the silence, I guess. Back in the 90s, they decided that these things are terrible and they gotta go. And of course it was all nonsense. I mean, plenty of people play violent video games, particularly Doom, which is cartoony and has demons exploding in pools of blood. And somehow we don't have a mass spat of crime all across the country. In fact, crime rates have been falling in America for decades. And so we have the same sort of moral panic going on now. People think that, oh, geez, these young kids, they're so far right and terrible. What do they have that we didn't? Well, of course, the answer is YouTube. YouTube is the new thing since 2005. I've been on YouTube since, 2007. And the folks who didn't grow up with it are liable now to blame everything that they don't like about modern society on this new aspect of our culture. Folks look at YouTube and they say, back in my day, CNN was just fine. I got all my news at 6 o'clock from Wolf Blitzer. And the Gen Xers say, hey, back in the 2000s when we really didn't like George Bush, we just watched The Daily Show. And so as easily as that, they write off people like Philip DeFranco and Steven Crowder as enemies of America, rotting away at our society from within. And most of these folks do so not of their own accord, but rather at the behest of the news journalists at places like the New York Times and other mainstream media outlets who have the most to lose from all this competition from YouTubers, folks like Tim Pool or, I can't say his name because my video will get demonetized. But other YouTube journalists who have been targeted by mainstream outlets for doing normal journalist work. And not to mention, of course, I haven't even got to the pure opinion commentators, folks like, Styx Hexenhammer or Sargon of Akkad, because, of course, those are the real Nazis, people like Sargon, wink, wink. I look at how they treat people with very, very mainstream and not middle of the road, but mainstream common opinions, like Steven Crowder, who is ideologically, pretty much right along the lines of, Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or, Ted Cruz or any of these other, normal conservative Republicans, and yet they say that he's somehow new and dangerous and, a threat to society, as if, he's presenting some sort of new ideas, as if new ideas in and of themselves are a threat to society. But the thing is that Crowder is not even that different. Tim Pool and Phil DeFranco, not really out of the mainstream at all. I mean, they're pretty right down the middle. Paul Joseph Watson, again, he's a pretty normal conservative by American standards. I don't know about by British standards. Oh, I didn't even mention that Ben Shapiro is also in this collage. The Orthodox Jew. Yeah, he's the alt-right guy now. Of course, I think that it's almost not even worth pointing out now. They pull that card so much and call the very Jewish pro-Israel guy the alt-righter. I can't even begin to imagine what these people would think of me, because I look at all these folks and I see nothing but a cadre of moderates. I see folks who largely, in the case of the right-wingers, support the war state even. I mean, sure, you got folks like, Stefan Molyneux and others on the right on YouTube who thankfully are against the wars. I think that would actually be a majority of the right-wingers on YouTube because, you kind of get that independent thought. But, I mean, the very mainstream people like Crowder or Ben Shapiro, the folks who really have influence, they are about as pro-war as the New York Times, or even more in a lot of cases. I think I've heard Ben Shapiro's criticism of the New York Times typically is that, they're way too anti-Israel. But I think it's pretty clear from reading this article, which I will link below, from this, what is his name, Caleb Kane or something, that the real problem that the New York Times and this guy have with the alternative media folks on YouTube is not so much that they have a difference of opinion with them, because some of them are not even that different from the New York Times. The problem is just that they are a form of competition that it's very difficult for the New York Times to compete with, because look at the distribution. Distribution on YouTube is free. If you're a YouTuber, it doesn't cost you any money to put out videos, whereas the New York Times, they have to buy their ink by the barrel, so to speak. The New York Times has corporate offices in New York City. That's very expensive to maintain. Somebody like Tim Pool broadcasts from his apartment. So another Sunday, another nonsensical article from the New York Times. I hope that some of you gained some enjoyment out of this video. Because if you did, I would very much appreciate it if you would click that like button and subscribe. And if you do subscribe, make sure to click the bell, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. And if you haven't already, go subscribe to my BitChute, because frankly, I think that there's more of a future for us over there than on YouTube anyway, despite what the New York Times might have to say about, considering the YouTube's a den of the alt-right. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.